So when it comes to the Republican race for the presidency, several of the contenders are talking tough about their plans to overhaul the Department of Justice.
We're going to clean house across all the senior levels of the Department of Justice and the FBI.
And you know, with me, you get a new FBI director on day one. That will happen.
As President of the United States, I would purge all of the injustices and impurities in our system.
Joining us now, senior writer for The Dispatch, David Drucker, with more reporting on this. So if you could tell us about their plans to overhaul the DOJ. In fact, let me read a part of your piece. David has this piece entitled GOP Contenders Overhype Plans to Overhaul the DOJ. Most Republican presidential contenders are promising big changes at the Department of Justice if they win the White House. Clean house, some say. Complete overhaul, say others. Their plans may sound radical and unprecedented. They're not. Every new president effectively fires senior personnel at the Department of Justice and their deputies, numbering in the hundreds upon taking office. I think, David, though, the concern here, I'll stop right there, is that Donald Trump sort of had a different approach to this and considered people in the Department of Justice. And, for example, his attorney general, he assumed that they were sort of his attorneys.
Right. So if you look at how Donald Trump tried to run the Justice Department, it's understandable why some people are concerned about what he might do in a second term. I think what we saw at DOJ in the first term, though, shows you the limits of how much a president is able to meddle because of the law, because of regulations at DOJ. But I think the point that I wanted to emphasize, Mika, was not that presidents and their new attorneys general do not have, and deputies and U.S. attorneys do not have prosecutorial discretion, and that can change with every new president. They can bring cases and choose not to bring other cases. But just to point out that and it was curious to me because of all the concern that Republican voters have about how Trump is being treated by the Department of Justice, when you hear these candidates talk about sweeping everybody out, cleaning house, bringing in a whole new group that's going to do things differently. Well, this whole new group may do things differently, but number one, they're going to be constrained by the law. And number two, this goes on every time we have a changing of the guard, at least from a partisan perspective. A Republican president comes in. They appoint a whole new fleet of U.S. attorneys, a whole new fleet of senior and middle management leaders at the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, all of the deputies. When a Democratic president comes in, they do the same thing. And this is just a part of what happens when we have a change in government. And so it's not as the hype doesn't really match reality in that they may make changes, but they're going to be changes. The American people may not like the prosecutorial decisions, the policy decisions, but they're not going to have any issues with these changes from a constitutional perspective. And that's in large part because the career attorneys at DOJ are protected by civil service law. And unless you get Congress to approve changes in civil service law, it's very hard to, as one of the contenders has said, Vivek Ramaswamy, it's very hard to gut the bureaucracy at the Department of Justice because of how our laws are set up.
Yeah, David, also, I talk about the reality that many of the jobs that do turn over with each administration are, in fact, confirmed by the Senate. So that, for example, right now, there are many jurisdictions that do not have U.S. attorneys because the Republicans are refusing to confirm them. My state is a good example. We have no U.S. attorneys in Missouri right now. They're all acting and not permanent replacements because the senators from Missouri are refusing to cooperate. So speak to that and the problems that go with that. But also, I want to make sure you delineate what civil service protections FBI agents have. Because really what a lot of these candidates are talking about is trying to rebuild or redo or start over with the FBI. Talk about the problems associated with the FBI in particular.
Well, let's take two of those issues one at a time. First of all, U.S. attorneys are, of course, federal prosecutors. Occasionally there are holdovers, right? The Biden administration under Attorney General Merrick Garland chose to leave David Weiss, the U.S. Attorney for Delaware, in place because he is in the middle of handling the Hunter Biden investigation, and they didn't want to have any sense of impropriety by bringing in somebody new and taking out somebody appointed by a Republican president because of when that investigation started during the Trump administration. So some of these attorneys are left in place. By and large, federal prosecutors are changed out, and when you have a Senate that is so evenly divided, it can be hard to get Senate confirmation for many of these positions. Now, in the old days, when it took 60 votes for a confirmation, things could be difficult no matter what. It only takes 51 votes for Senate confirmations for executive branch employees, but it's difficult when Democrats have either a 50-vote majority, as they had last cycle, or if they have a 51-vote majority, as they have now. With the FBI, I think a president is going to have a little bit more flexibility. Number one, even though FBI directors have 10-year terms, the president can fire the FBI director and replace him. It's a Senate-confirmed position. They can't just handpick anybody. This can have an impact on a lot of the senior leadership and middle management at the FBI. But anybody that is career is going to have the same civil service protections. And again, it's not that laws can't change, but you're not going to find 60 votes in the Senate, cooperation from Democrats, even if Republicans control the House, even if Republicans control the Senate, to change civil service law in that manner. There are things, Senator, you can do. You can move civil service employees, and I report this in the story for the Dispatch, you can move some civil service employees to new positions and effectively what they like to call rubber room them. Here, go count widgets for the rest of your career here. You can move them to a new position and then eliminate that position. So there are some things you can do, but a wholesale gutting is just something that, when I talked to veterans of the Department of Justice, both Democrats and Republicans, they just said it's not going to happen. What they said to focus on is prosecutorial discretion and policies that inform that a new president brings in.
Senior writer for the Dispatch, David Drucker, thank you very much.